The city never really slept, but from her penthouse balcony, Evelyn Moore liked to pretend it did. Far below, Manhattan glittered under a haze of mist and noise, the yellow cabs like fireflies trapped in glass. The hum of life dimmed to a distant pulse. Inside, a grand piano rested silent in the corner, and a single lamp cast soft amber over the marble floor. Evelyn stood barefoot by the window, a glass of Cabernet resting loosely between her fingers, the reflection of the skyline rippling against the glass. Her phone buzzed. Another email from Alder Corporation. The subject line, "Final confirmation, merger decision required." She didn't open it. Not yet. The weight of her choice pressed against her chest, heavier than the city itself. For 10 years, she had built Alder from a small investment firm into one of Wall Street's most unpredictable giants. She had turned calculated risks into art, defied analysts, made enemies, and inspired fear. Every headline had her name in bold. Evelyn Moore, the woman who beat the street. But lately, every victory had begun to feel hollow, like clapping for herself in an empty theater. The money, the headlines, the empire, it all blurred together until the sound of her own success became unbearable. Her reflection stared back at her, sharp cheekbones, perfectly tied hair, eyes that didn't blink. She looked powerful, but she also looked tired. The kind of tired that seeps into the bones and whispers that something is missing. That was when the doorbell rang. She set the glass down and crossed the polished floor. The man waiting outside wore a tuxedo and a grin that didn't quite belong to the world of skyscrapers and mergers. Richard Harrington, billionaire, philanthropist, heir to the Harrington Holdings empire. The papers loved him. So did half the women in New York. Still working at 10 p.m. on a Friday? He teased as she opened the door. Evelyn Moore, the legend herself, too busy to let someone take her to dinner? She gave a small smile. "I don't usually eat with my competition." "Then consider it reconnaissance," he said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. "Besides, I heard Alder's about to crush us in the energy sector. I'd like to meet the woman who's doing the crushing." Evelyn folded her arms, amused. "You think flattery works on me?" "It's not flattery if it's true." He wandered toward the window, gazing out at the city that belonged to both of them. Hers in dominance, his in inheritance. There was something disarming about him, something that made him seem almost boyish beneath the polish. "Do you ever stop?" he asked, turning back to her. "You've built something incredible, but you ever think about what comes next?" "What comes next?" she echoed. "You mean after winning?" He laughed softly. "Maybe. Or after fighting. After proving you can." Evelyn hesitated. No one had ever asked her that before. Not in that way. Not without an angle. Later that night, over dinner at the rooftop restaurant of the Whitmore, the conversation drifted from finance to music, from politics to childhood memories. He told her about growing up with too much money and not enough love. She told him about clawing her way up through boardrooms that had laughed in her face. And somewhere between dessert and the last sip of wine, Evelyn realized she was laughing. Not the careful, composed laugh she gave investors, but something real. She hadn't done that in years. When the night ended, Richard didn't try to kiss her. He just said, "You're a storm, Evelyn. I think I'd like to get caught in you." She didn't know then that he already was the storm, and she was the one about to drown. The following months moved like a blur. They saw each other at galas, business summits, art auctions. He sent flowers to her office, always white orchids, elegant, understated, like the life he imagined for her. For once, she allowed herself to be courted. Her colleagues whispered, "Of course. Evelyn Moore, dating the enemy?" But Evelyn didn't care. For the first time in a decade, she wasn't negotiating a deal. She was just living. And perhaps that's why she didn't see it coming. The quiet voice in her head that began to whisper, "What if you stopped?" It started small. A single weekend off. A missed call from her board. A dinner she skipped for a late-night drive along the Hudson with Richard, windows down, his laughter filling the car. Then one night, as rain hammered against the penthouse glass, Richard leaned over and said, "You know, you could walk away from all this. You've already proven yourself. You could actually live." She turned to him, startled. "And do what?" He smiled. "Be happy. Be free." She wanted to laugh. Freedom? She already had it. Didn't she? But the word hung there, echoing, sticky and sweet. Maybe she was tired of fighting. Maybe she wanted to stop being the woman who could do anything and just be someone loved for who she was. It took her 3 weeks to make the decision. 3 weeks to dismantle the fortress she'd built. The night she resigned, she stood in her office one last time, running her fingers along the glass desk that had witnessed her rise. Her assistant Clara stared at her like she was witnessing an execution. "You can't be serious," Clara whispered. "You built this company." "I know," Evelyn said quietly. "But maybe it's time someone else builds something. You're not just leaving the company, you're leaving yourself." Evelyn forced a smile. Maybe that's the point. When she walked out of Alder that evening, the city lights looked different. Softer, almost forgiving. She didn't realize yet that forgiveness and surrender sometimes wear the same disguise. Marriage came quickly after that. Richard proposed on a cliff in Maui at sunset, the ocean stretching endlessly behind him, the ring catching the last golden light. She said yes before her mind had time to catch up with her heart. The wedding was grand, of course. 2 financial empires colliding under crystal chandeliers and champagne fountains. The media called it the merger of the century. Evelyn wore a dress of ivory silk and pearls, her hair loose, her face glowing with a happiness that almost felt like disbelief. Afterward, they moved into his penthouse overlooking Central Park. The days slowed. The pace that once defined her life melted into something domestic, almost alien. At first, she found comfort in it. Morning coffee together, late breakfasts, charity events. She told herself she was learning to rest, to breathe. But slowly, the quiet turned from soothing to suffocating. Richard was often gone, busy with company matters. When he was home, he would bring gifts, expensive ones, impersonal ones, as if throwing money at the space between them. And the comments began. "You don't need to work, Evie. I make enough for both of us. You're too intense sometimes. Just enjoy the life I've given you. You used to be fierce. Now look at you. Softer suits you." She told herself he meant well. That love sometimes came with small cruelties. Until one night at a dinner party, when someone joked about women CEOs being too emotional to lead. Richard laughed. Not loudly, but loud enough for her to hear, and added, "That's why I'm lucky my wife gave up the boardroom for the kitchen. She'd terrify my staff." The table roared with laughter. Evelyn smiled tightly, her fingers gripping the stem of her wine glass until she felt it threaten to crack. That night, after the guests left, she asked him quietly, "Why did you say that?" He shrugged. It was a joke. It didn't sound like one. "Evie, don't start. You know how people are. Besides, I like you this way. Relaxed, safe. You don't need to prove anything anymore." Safe. The word lingered like poison. Months blurred into years. Evelyn learned to measure her days not by deals closed or headlines made, but by social events attended, dinners cooked, foundations funded in her name but not in her control. Her old colleagues stopped calling. Some moved on, some pitied her. She didn't know which was worse. She spent afternoons walking through Central Park, watching women in business suits hurry past, their phones pressed to their ears, their faces fierce and alive. Sometimes she'd catch her reflection in a shop window, polished, beautiful, and hollow. There were moments, small, cruel moments, when she'd catch Richard's eyes across a room and see, not admiration, but something else. Ownership. He liked her better this way. Quiet, ornamental, predictable. And she played along because somewhere deep inside, she believed she had chosen this. That she had traded one kind of power for another, and it was too late to undo it. Until the morning the FBI came. It was raining that day. She was in the kitchen, slicing lemons for tea, when the sound of shouting filled the hall. The front door burst open. Agents poured in, shouting commands, their jackets flashing FBI in bold yellow letters. "Richard Harrington, you're under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice." The teacup slipped from her hand, shattering across the floor. Richard appeared from the study, his face pale but composed. For a moment, he looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw, not fear, but calculation. As the agents cuffed him, he turned his head slightly and said almost gently, "Don't get in my way, Evie. You wouldn't understand how this world works anymore." And then he was gone. She stood there in silence, the lemons still half cut on the counter, the city roaring beyond the windows. The life she had built, or allowed to be built around her, cracked open in an instant. The news spread like wildfire. Every channel, every site, every whisper in Manhattan carried the same story. Harrington Empire collapses in fraud scandal. But beneath the chaos, beneath the headlines, something strange stirred inside Evelyn. Something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not grief. Something colder, sharper, clarity. That night, when the lights went out in the penthouse and the world outside still screamed his name, Evelyn walked into Richard's private office. The lamp. The desk was immaculate, too immaculate, the kind of neatness that hides secrets. She sat down, opened his laptop, and tried a password. His birthday. Nothing. The company name. Nothing. Then she paused, an old instinct flickering awake, a whisper from a life she had buried. Slowly she typed, Aldercorp 1989. The screen unlocked, and as the files opened before her, financial statements, loan trails, internal memos, Evelyn felt something inside her shift. It was like watching a ghost come back to life. The woman who had once dominated Wall Street, the strategist who saw patterns in chaos, the leader who didn't blink when others panicked. She was still there. She had just been sleeping. Evelyn leaned back in the chair, her reflection flickering in the dark glass of the window, and whispered to herself, "You shouldn't have underestimated me, Richard." Outside, the city pulsed, restless, alive, waiting. And somewhere deep in her chest, Evelyn felt it again. That fierce, unrelenting hunger she thought she had killed. It was back, and it was starving. She stood up, eyes fixed on the skyline, her mind already moving, mapping, calculating, planning. The world thought the Harrington Empire had fallen. They had no idea that its most dangerous mind was just beginning to wake. The next morning, Evelyn Harrington would walk into the boardroom for the first time in years, and the war would begin. The sun had not yet risen when Evelyn Harrington opened her eyes. For a moment, she didn't move. The city outside her window was a bruised shade of blue, heavy with fog. She could hear the faint hum of traffic below, the sound of rain sliding against the glass, and somewhere in the distance, a siren crying out like a wounded animal. It was the kind of morning that felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting. She sat up, her silk nightgown tangled around her legs, the sheets cold beside her. The bed was too large, too empty. The smell of Richard's cologne still lingered on the pillow, faint and stale, like a ghost that refused to leave. Her phone was full of messages. Reporters, lawyers, investors. She ignored them all. Instead, she walked to the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked like someone else. Pale skin, hair undone, eyes lined with exhaustion. But there was something different too. A sharpness, a kind of dangerous calm. She whispered to her reflection, her voice low and steady. "You've done this before." The clock on the wall read 6:12 a.m. 3 hours of sleep, that would have to do. She tied her hair into a loose knot, threw on a cashmere coat, and stepped into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, her heart began to beat in that old familiar rhythm, the one she used to feel before a major acquisition, before stepping onto a stage to announce a billion-dollar merger. Not fear, focus. By the time she reached the lobby, she had already made a plan. Step 1, access control. Step 2, assemble information. Step 3, act before anyone else does. The driver was waiting outside, engine running, eyes wide as if unsure whether to speak. "Mrs. Harrington, I heard about Mr. Harrington." "Drive," she said softly. "Downtown." He nodded, and they moved through the rain-slicked streets in silence. Manhattan at dawn looked like the aftermath of a war, littered, wet, exhausted. Billboards still flashed with the headlines. "Richard Harrington arrested in fraud scandal. Harrington Holdings under federal investigation." When the car stopped in front of the company tower, the press was already there. Cameras, microphones, umbrellas clashing like shields. Evelyn pulled the hood of her coat over her head and walked through the storm of questions. "Mrs. Harrington, did you know about your husband's crimes? Is Harrington Holdings collapsing? Will you be taking over as CEO?" She said nothing. Only the sound of her heels answered. Sharp, echoing, steady. Inside, the lobby was chaos. Security guards tried to control the flood of reporters and panicked employees. The receptionists, pale and shaking, were answering phones that never stopped ringing. Someone recognized her and froze. "Mrs. Harrington, I thought you wouldn't—" "I need access to the executive floor," Evelyn interrupted. Her voice was cool, precise, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. "Now." Moments later, she was standing in the elevator again, watching the floor numbers climb. 37, 38, 39, all the way to 52. The doors opened with a metallic sigh. The top floor of Harrington Holdings was glass and steel and silence. The storm outside painted silver streaks across the panoramic windows. Richard's office stood at the end of the hallway, the nameplate still shining on the door. When she entered, the smell of his cologne hit her again. The desk was untouched since yesterday, as if he might walk in any second. For a long moment, she just stood there, taking it in. This was his kingdom, the one he built with arrogance, charm, and lies. Now it was hers. Evelyn sat down in his chair. It felt strange, both familiar and foreign, like slipping into an old skin. She opened the laptop she had unlocked the night before, scrolling through files, her fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon. She saw the numbers immediately. Offshore accounts, ghost subsidiaries, fake valuations propping up entire divisions. Harrington Holdings wasn't just in trouble, it was bleeding out. She picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. After a few rings, a groggy voice answered. "Hello? Daniel Wu. It's Evelyn." A pause, then disbelief. "Evelyn Moore. Jesus, it's been—" "No time. I need access to Alder's trading desk, confidentially." "You're asking your former company—" "I'm not asking," she said. "I'm calling in a favor. We both know you owe me one." Silence, then a quiet exhale. "What do you need?" "Real-time reports on Harrington Holdings positions. Every derivative, every bond, every shell company tied to them. And Daniel—" "Yeah?" "If I'm right, this will be the biggest cleanup in Wall Street history." By noon, Evelyn had built a war room out of her husband's office. She spread the documents across the desk, printed statements, emails, transaction ledgers. She worked through lunch, through the growing murmur of panic outside. At 2 p.m., the board arrived. 8 men, 1 woman, all dressed in black suits, all looking at her as if she were a foreign invader. "Mrs. Harrington," said the chairman, his voice slow and condescending, "I understand this is a difficult time for you, but we have everything under control." "Really?" she asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, this company is 12 hours away from default." A ripple of discomfort passed around the table. "We are preparing a statement." "No," Evelyn said sharply. "Statements don't fix liquidity. I've reviewed the numbers. The company is leveraged to collapse. Your cash reserves are already frozen by the feds. You have 3 days before this entire structure disintegrates." One of the directors frowned. "With all due respect, Mrs. Harrington, you don't have the authority." Evelyn stood, slowly, deliberately. Her gaze swept across the room, slicing through their arrogance like glass. "Gentlemen," she said softly, "you're talking to the woman who built Alder from a failing startup into a $5 billion competitor. The woman your CEO tried to buy out and couldn't. I may not have official authority, but I have more experience than every man at this table combined. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to sit down, shut up, and help me keep this company alive." The room fell silent. It wasn't the words, it was the way she said them. Calm, controlled, deadly. The chairman cleared his throat. "And what exactly do you propose?" Evelyn turned to the boardroom screen, pressing a button. A complex network of transactions and company names lit up. A web of deceit connecting shell accounts, falsified partnerships, and debt structures. "This," she said, "is what your brilliant CEO built while you were too busy enjoying the profits. This company isn't collapsing because of bad luck. It's collapsing because of cowardice." Someone whispered, "How do you know all this?" She smiled without warmth. "Because I taught him half of it." That stunned them into silence. The meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end, 3 board members had resigned, 2 had threatened lawsuits, and 1 had nearly fainted. Evelyn didn't flinch. She assigned tasks, made calls, and issued orders with the precision of a general commanding a siege. By dusk, the building was nearly empty, but her office lights still burned. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city washed and cold. Her phone buzzed again. "Daniel." "You were right," he said. "The company's exposure is massive. You're looking at a full-scale implosion if you don't raise at least $500 million by Friday." "Can Alder help?" A pause. "Not directly. We're competitors now, remember? But I might know a few people willing to move quietly, if the price is right." Evelyn looked at the skyline, the glittering towers of glass that once felt like her playground. "Send them to me." By midnight, she was on her second pot of coffee, eyes burning but mind sharper than ever. The office was silent except for the sound of her typing. She was piecing together the map of a war, debts, assets, subsidiaries, all flowing into a single strategy. 3 days. That was all she had. Day 1, cut the rot. Day 2, rebuild confidence. Day 3, bring the company back from the dead. Simple in theory, impossible in practice. But impossible had always been her favorite word. At some point, she stood and walked to the window. Below, the city lights shimmered like constellations. She remembered the first time she had seen them from this height. Back when she was still Evelyn Moore, before she became someone's wife, someone's accessory. Funny, she thought. She had given up everything to escape the fight, and now she was back in it. Alone, cornered, alive. She pressed her palm against the glass. The cold bit into her skin, grounding her. She would save this company. Not for Richard, not for the empire, but for herself. For the woman she used to be, and the one she still could be. The next morning, she arrived at the building before anyone else. The sun had barely touched the horizon, painting the skyscrapers gold. She carried 2 cups of coffee, one for herself, one for the receptionist who had been working all night. The young woman blinked in surprise when Evelyn handed it to her. Thank you, ma'am. Call me Evelyn, she said, and smiled faintly. Word spread quickly. Mrs. Harrington was back. Not the socialite, not the trophy wife, but something far more dangerous. By noon, the press had caught wind of her presence. Sources say Evelyn Harrington has taken temporary control of the company, one reporter announced. Could she be the key to saving the empire her husband destroyed? Inside, Evelyn ignored the noise. She was too busy leading. She moved from department to department, speaking to terrified employees, reading data, reorganizing teams. Every room she entered seemed to straighten at her presence, as if the building itself remembered what power felt like. When she spoke, her voice carried a calm authority. "We are not victims," she told them. "We are survivors. This company will not fall on my watch." By the end of the second day, the first signs of stability appeared. Investors stopped withdrawing funds. Rumors began to shift. Someone leaked an internal memo, her memo, outlining the recovery plan. The markets responded. The free fall slowed. Evelyn barely noticed the exhaustion. She lived on coffee and adrenaline. Each night she would return to the penthouse, step out of her heels, and stare at the empty side of the bed. The silence was deafening, but she didn't mind anymore. It gave her space to think. On the third morning, as dawn bled into the sky, Evelyn sat alone at the office desk. The final deal, a private equity rescue package, was almost complete. She had done it. 3 days. She leaned back in the chair, letting out a long breath. Outside, the city glowed with promise again. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She answered. A familiar voice came through, weary and low. "Evie." "Richard." For a moment she said nothing. She could hear the echo of the prison phone line, the distant clang of metal. "I heard," he said. "You saved it." "Yes." "How?" "You shouldn't have underestimated me," she said quietly. There was a long pause. Then he laughed, not cruelly, just softly, as if he finally understood the joke that had been on him all along. "I always said you were a storm," he murmured. "I just didn't know I'd be the one washed away." She didn't reply. When the call ended, she sat in silence, the phone still in her hand. Then she stood, walked to the window, and watched the sunrise climb between the towers. The city was awake again, and so was she. Later that afternoon, Evelyn walked through the trading floor, a quiet smile playing on her lips as the staff applauded. She raised a hand, not in pride, but in acknowledgement. The company was safe, for now. As she entered the elevator, a young analyst ran up. "Mrs. Harrington, the news wants a statement." Evelyn turned, her eyes steady. "Tell them this," she said. "The Harrington name might be tarnished, but its legacy has just been rewritten." The doors slid shut, and for the first time in years, she felt free. Not from her marriage, not from scandal, but from the version of herself that had forgotten who she was. When the elevator opened at the ground floor, the flash of cameras met her again. She walked through them, calm, poised, unflinching, while the rain began to fall once more. This time, it felt like a baptism. The woman the world had called a housewife was gone. In her place stood Evelyn Moore Harrington, the storm reborn. And somewhere deep inside her, a new question began to form. If she could rebuild what he destroyed, what else could she create? This time, entirely her own. She smiled to herself as the car door closed behind her. The city stretched ahead, endless and alive. The war was over. But the empire she was about to build had only just begun. The rain had stopped by the time Evelyn stepped out of the car. It had been 3 weeks since the scandal. 3 weeks since she turned a collapsing empire into a headline of survival. Harrington Holdings was not just standing, it was recovering, cautiously but visibly, like a patient breathing again after a long coma. The papers called it the miracle of Midtown. Others called it the revenge of the housewife. Evelyn didn't care what they called it. For the first time in years, she didn't care what anyone thought at all. The street was unusually quiet that morning, washed clean by the storm that had swept through overnight. She walked into the building, her heels clicking softly on the marble, the echo sharp but not harsh. The receptionist smiled at her nervously, as if in the presence of something both sacred and terrifying. Evelyn gave a polite nod and stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, she caught her reflection in the mirrored wall. Tailored charcoal suit, no jewelry except for a thin gold bracelet, her hair tied in a knot of understated precision. Her eyes were calm but not cold, alive but unreadable. She looked like the woman she used to be, and yet, not quite. Something inside her had shifted, not broken, transformed. When she reached the 52nd floor, the doors opened to a sea of applause. Employees stood lined along the corridor, clapping as she walked past. Some had tears in their eyes. A few whispered, "She saved us." Evelyn smiled faintly, but didn't stop. She didn't need praise. She needed momentum. In Richard's former office, now hers, though she hadn't officially accepted the title, the morning light flooded through the glass. She stood by the window, looking out over the city that had both crowned and crucified her. Behind her, the board entered quietly. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harrington." "Evelyn," she corrected without turning around. "Evelyn," he said, hesitating. "We owe you our gratitude. You've stabilized the company in a way none of us thought possible. The markets are responding, investors are returning, and the media, well, the media has made you into something of a legend." She turned then, eyes level. "I'm not interested in legend. I'm interested in longevity." He smiled nervously. "Of course. Still, we believe it's time to make it official. The board would like to offer you the role of CEO." The room held its breath. Evelyn studied the faces around the table, men who once dismissed her, who had whispered that she was nothing without her husband. Now they looked at her like she was the sun. "I appreciate the offer," she said finally, "but no." The room erupted in murmurs. "No? I came here to save the company, not to inherit it. The Harrington name needs time to breathe, to rebuild trust. That can't happen if the wife of a convicted felon becomes its face." The chairman frowned. "But surely you—" Evelyn raised a hand, silencing him. "I'll stay until the transition is complete. I'll help choose the right leader, but after that, I'm done." He stared at her, puzzled. "Done with what?" She turned back toward the window. The skyline gleamed in the morning light. "With building someone else's empire." That evening, she walked home through Central Park instead of taking the car. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and distant rain. The city pulsed around her, alive, electric, unaware of her thoughts. She passed a group of young professionals huddled under umbrellas, laughing about stock prices and deals. Once, she would have been one of them. Sharp, relentless, unstoppable. Now she just listened, smiling faintly at their confidence, their hunger. When she reached the penthouse, the doorman greeted her with the usual polite nod. "Evening, Mrs. Harrington?" "Good evening, James," she replied, though the title still felt like wearing someone else's skin. Upstairs, the apartment was quiet. Too quiet. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was hollow. She set her bag down, slipped off her heels, and walked toward the piano. It was covered in a thin layer of dust. She wiped her hand across it absently, her fingers leaving trails like old memories. On the kitchen counter sat a stack of unopened letters, legal documents, bank statements, invitations. One envelope caught her eye. The return address read Federal Correctional Facility, Richard Harrington. She hesitated. For a moment she thought about throwing it away, but something, curiosity, perhaps pity, made her open it. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, almost too careful. Evie, they tell me you saved everything. I suppose I should say thank you, though it feels strange to thank someone who replaced me. The papers make you out to be a hero. Maybe you are. Maybe I was wrong about you. I used to think you left your world behind when you married me. Turns out, you just put it on pause. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to tell you. I understand now what it feels like to be powerless. And I understand that you were never meant to be. Ah. Evelyn folded the letter and stared at it for a long time. She didn't feel anger or sadness or even closure, just an odd kind of calm. She placed it back in the envelope and slid it into a drawer. When she looked up again, her eyes fell on the city skyline, the same skyline that had watched her rise, fall, and rise again. Somewhere out there, people were still whispering her name, but she was done being someone's story. She was ready to write her own. The next day, she met with Daniel Wu at a small cafe downtown. He was waiting by the window, sipping espresso, his tie loosened, his expression curious. "Evelyn Moore," he said as she sat down. "Or should I say Harrington?" "Let's keep it Moore for now," she replied, smiling slightly. He leaned back. "You've been busy. Half of Wall Street is talking about you." "They always talk," she said. "It's what they do when they're afraid." He laughed. "So what's next? You could have any job you want, any board, any firm." She stirred her coffee, watching the swirl of cream dissolve. "I don't want a job. I want purpose." Daniel studied her. "You sound like someone planning something dangerous." She met his gaze, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Maybe I am." He leaned forward. "What kind of purpose?" Evelyn glanced out the window. Across the street, a young woman in a wrinkled blazer was arguing with a cab driver, clutching a cheap handbag and a folder of resumes. She couldn't have been more than 25, tired, determined, invisible to the world. Evelyn recognized that look. She had worn it once. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about women who step away from their careers. Mothers, wives, caregivers. The ones who get told they're wasting potential. They don't stop being capable. They just stop being seen." Daniel frowned. "You want to start a foundation?" "I want to start a movement," Evelyn said. "Something that proves power doesn't vanish when you choose family. I want to build something for them. Funding, mentorship, training, call it what you will. But I want them to have what I didn't." He nodded, impressed. "You already have a name?" A small smile curved her lips. "The Homemaker Fund." He raised an eyebrow. "Bold. People will underestimate it." "That's the point," she said. "They always underestimate women like us. And that's why we always win." By the end of the month, the foundation was real. An office, a staff, a website that crashed on launch day because of the overwhelming response. Former executives, stay-at-home mothers, retired teachers. Hundreds of women reached out, each with a story that mirrored some part of Evelyn's own. The press came calling again. Headlines read, "From CEO to Advocate, Evelyn Harrington's new mission." At first she resisted interviews, but one evening she agreed to appear on a late-night news special. The studio lights were bright, almost blinding. The host smiled across the table. "Evelyn, the world watched you rescue a company from disaster. Now you're walking away from billions to start a non-profit. Why?" Evelyn took a moment before answering. "Because I've seen what happens when a woman's worth is measured only by the man beside her. I've lived it. I'm done playing that part." The host leaned forward. "You mean your husband?" She didn't flinch. "I mean every husband, every boss, every system that tells women their power is conditional." The audience was silent. The host looked almost moved. And the Homemaker Fund. What do you want it to represent? Evelyn smiled, calm and fierce all at once. Hope, redemption, a reminder that sometimes starting over isn't weakness, it's evolution. When the show aired, it went viral overnight. Donations flooded in. Messages from women around the world filled her inbox. Teachers, nurses, homemakers, entrepreneurs. They didn't see her as the wife of a scandal or the savior of a company. They saw her as proof that reinvention was possible. One evening, as she left the foundation office, she walked past a small conference room where a group of women were sharing stories. One was crying softly, another held her hand. Evelyn paused at the doorway, unseen, watching them. That's when she realized this, right here, was the empire she was meant to build. Not built on money or power, but on resilience, on the quiet, relentless strength of women who refused to stay invisible. Later that night, she returned to the penthouse for the last time. The movers would come in the morning. She had decided to sell it. The view was beautiful, but it belonged to a version of her that no longer existed. She poured herself a final glass of wine and stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. Somewhere, in a federal cell miles away, Richard Harrington was probably reading about her in the papers. Maybe he was proud. Maybe he was bitter. It didn't matter. The skyline shimmered, reflected in the glass like a memory. She touched it lightly, whispering to herself, "I thought I needed you to become someone. Turns out, I just needed to remember who I was." She finished the wine, set the glass down, and walked toward the door. When she stepped out into the hallway, she didn't look back. Outside, the city was alive again. Taxis honked, the air hummed, the future waited. As she walked, her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "Dinner with investors tomorrow. They want to back the Homemaker Fund. You in?" Evelyn typed one word back. "Always." Then she slipped her phone into her pocket and kept walking. The wind tugged at her coat, the streetlights painted her in gold. For the first time in a long time, she felt light. Not because she had won, but because she had let go. The empire was behind her. The movement was ahead. And in between, that fleeting, perfect balance, was Evelyn. The next morning, as dawn broke over Manhattan, she stood on the balcony of her new apartment, smaller, quieter, overlooking the East River. The water caught the first light, rippling like molten silver. She sipped her coffee and smiled. This was freedom. Not the kind Richard once promised her, but the kind she had built herself. And as the sun rose higher, washing the city in gold, Evelyn whispered the first words of her next chapter under her breath. A vow, a prayer, a beginning. Never again invisible. The first time Evelyn walked into the new headquarters of the Homemaker Fund, it didn't feel like an office, it felt like a heartbeat. The space was light and open, filled with sunlight that streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows and spilled over desks where women from every age, race, and story worked side by side. No marble, no gold accents, no corporate coldness, just warmth, quiet confidence, and the hum of purpose. She stood there for a long moment, watching them. The laughter, the intensity, the way ideas sparked across the room like fire catching paper. These were not women chasing approval or pretending to belong in someone else's world. They were building their own. A few noticed her standing there and smiled, but they didn't stop working. Evelyn liked that. She didn't want reverence. She wanted momentum. She walked toward her office, a modest glass room tucked into the corner, its walls covered not with degrees or photographs, but handwritten letters pinned in careful rows. Notes from women who had received funding, mentorship, a second chance. Evelyn read one every morning before she began her day. It grounded her more than any boardroom ever had. That morning, as she set her coffee down, her assistant knocked softly on the door. "You have a visitor?" Evelyn looked up. "Who?" The assistant hesitated. "A man. Says he's from the Times. But he's not press. He asked for you personally." Evelyn frowned. "Send him in." The man who entered was tall, early 40s perhaps, with a weathered face that spoke of long nights and harder truths. He introduced himself simply. "Michael Rowe, investigative journalist. I'm not here for an interview." "Then what are you here for?" He sat down across from her. "I've been writing a book about corporate scandals, Richard Harrington's case among others. I need your perspective, off the record." Her expression didn't change. "You want to know what it's like to be married to a criminal?" He met her gaze evenly. "No, I want to know what it's like to rebuild from one." Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "You're late to that story. I've already rebuilt." He smiled faintly. "That's not what I meant. I'm talking about the personal part, the cost." Something flickered across her face, a small shadow gone as quickly as it appeared. "And what do you think you'll find there?" "Maybe what people never see in women like you," he said. "The ones who look untouchable. Maybe the cracks that make you human." Evelyn looked at him for a long time. Then she stood and walked toward the window. The city stretched out below, shimmering, indifferent. "I'll give you an hour," she said quietly. "But you'll get the truth, not the tragedy." He nodded. "That's all I want." The interview lasted 4 hours. They talked about Alder, about the rise and fall of Harrington Holdings, about the 3 days that had rewritten her life. But slowly, the conversation turned inward, to what she had lost, what she had discovered, and the strange quiet that comes after survival. "I used to believe success would make me invincible," she said, watching the sunlight crawl across the floor. "But it doesn't. It isolates you. The higher you climb, the fewer people you can see clearly, until one day you're standing at the top and you realize there's no one left who really knows you." Michael listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally, but never breaking her rhythm. "When I left Alder," she continued, "I told myself I was choosing peace. But it wasn't peace. It was surrender disguised as love." He tilted his head. "Do you regret marrying him?" Evelyn smiled. Not bitterly, but with something close to gentleness. "No, regret wastes time. Besides, Richard gave me something I couldn't have found on my own." "What's that?" "Perspective. You can't understand freedom until you've given it away." He paused, pen hovering above the page. "Do you still think about him?" Her eyes drifted to the city again. "Sometimes, when the air smells like rain." He didn't press. When he left, he shook her hand. "You're not like the others I've interviewed," he said. "You talk about pain the way most people talk about strategy." Evelyn smiled. "Maybe they're the same thing." After he left, she sat alone for a long time. His questions had opened doors she'd closed long ago, doors that still had voices behind them. Outside, the clouds had thickened, darkening the afternoon. She took off her heels, walked barefoot across the office, and stood in front of the letters again. Dozens of them, stories of women who had lost, fallen, risen. She read one at random. "Dear Mrs. Harrington, I thought I was done. My husband left, I had 2 kids, and no one would hire a woman who hadn't worked in 10 years. Then I saw your interview. I took the grant, started my own business, and for the first time, I'm not afraid. Thank you for reminding me that invisible doesn't mean gone." Evelyn's throat tightened. She placed the letter back, then looked at the empty space on the wall. Space for more. She knew the foundation was growing fast, faster than anyone had expected. Investors wanted to scale it, franchise it, turn it into something global. But Evelyn wasn't sure she wanted that. The more something grows, the easier it is to lose its soul. That night, she couldn't sleep. The rain returned, drumming softly against the windows. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the city light flickering across her face. She thought about the past, about Richard's letter, about Michael's questions, about all the versions of herself she'd lived and shed. Somewhere between exhaustion and thought, she realized something. She had spent her entire life rebuilding. Companies, reputations, herself. But she had never learned how to simply exist without building something. The thought unsettled her. The next morning, she called Daniel. "I need to step back for a while," she said. He sounded surprised. "From the foundation?" "From everything. I want to take a break. Travel, maybe." "Evelyn Moore taking a vacation? That's newsworthy." She laughed softly. "Let them write it." Within a week, she was gone. She flew to Italy first, to Florence, then Rome, then down the Amalfi Coast. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, not even her board. She rented a small villa overlooking the sea, the kind of place that smelled of lemons and salt and silence. Days passed without meetings, without plans, without headlines. She walked through cobblestone streets, drank espresso at small cafes, wrote in a leather notebook she bought from a street vendor. She spoke to no one about her past, and for the first time in decades, she introduced herself only as Evelyn. No last name, no history attached. In the evenings, she cooked simple meals: pasta, grilled vegetables, wine poured generously. Sometimes she'd stand on the terrace and watch the sunset bleed into the horizon, the colors melting together like spilled paint. The sea whispered below, endless and forgiving. One night, she found herself in a small art gallery tucked into a quiet alley in Sorrento. The walls were lined with paintings of women, not glamorous, not idealized, just real. Wrinkled hands, tired eyes, soft smiles. The artist was an elderly woman named Rosa, her accent thick and musical. "You are not from here," Rosa said, studying her. "No," Evelyn replied, smiling. "But I wish I were." Rosa tilted her head. "You have the eyes of someone who has seen everything and still expects more." Evelyn laughed. "Maybe I've just learned not to stop looking." They talked for hours. Rosa told her about painting women who had been forgotten, widows, mothers, workers. "They all think their stories are small," she said, "but when I paint them, I see empires." That night, walking back to her villa, Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes. She thought of the women in her foundation, of herself, of the irony that it took losing everything to see what really mattered. She stayed in Italy for 2 months. By the time she returned to New York, summer had arrived. The city felt different, louder, brighter, younger. The foundation was thriving in her absence, run by capable women who no longer needed her hand on the wheel. Daniel greeted her with a hug. "You look human," he said, half joking. "Don't ruin it," she replied, smiling. But he wasn't wrong. There was a softness in her now, not weakness, but balance. She no longer moved like a soldier between battles. She moved like someone who had learned how to live inside her own skin. Still, something waited, unfinished. One afternoon, a letter arrived at her office. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper, the handwriting careful and deliberate. "Evie, they're letting me out next month. Good behavior, they say. Funny how time behaves differently when there's nothing left to control. I don't expect to see you, but I hope you're well. Maybe someday, if the world allows it, we can speak as people, not ghosts. Ah. She read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the same drawer as his first letter. For hours, she sat there, staring out at the city, thinking about all the ways stories end, and all the ways they don't. The day he was released, she didn't plan to go. She told herself she wouldn't. But that afternoon, without deciding, she found herself standing across the street from the correctional facility, leaning against her car as the gates opened. He walked out slowly, thinner, older, the arrogance stripped away, but not entirely gone. When he saw her, he stopped. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, he said, "I didn't think you'd come." "I didn't either." He smiled faintly. "You look different." So do you, she said, less invincible. They walked to a nearby park, quiet, empty except for a few trees turning gold in the late afternoon light. They sat on a bench, the silence stretching between them like an ocean. I followed the news, he said eventually. The foundation, the interviews. You did good. Evelyn nodded. I did what I had to. He looked at her, eyes softer than she remembered. You were always better at surviving than I was. That's because I had something to come back to. He smiled sadly. And what's that? Herself. He looked down, nodding slowly. I deserved that. They talked for nearly an hour. No apologies, no tears, just quiet acknowledgement of everything that had broken and everything that had somehow, against all odds, endured. When they finally stood to leave, he said, "You'll always be the best thing I ruined." Evelyn met his eyes. "No, you just showed me what I could rebuild." She walked away before he could reply. The sun was setting again, painting the city gold. Each step felt lighter, not because the past was gone, but because it no longer held her hostage. That night, as she returned home, she stood by her window, the new apartment smaller, simpler, but filled with light. She watched the river glint under the moon and thought of how far she'd come from the woman who once stood trembling in the wreckage of her husband's empire. Now, she didn't tremble. Now, she built. Not empires, not legacies, just life. And as the night deepened, she smiled, a quiet, private smile, knowing that somewhere the world was still writing about her. But this time, she didn't belong to the story. The story belonged to her. Outside, the wind whispered against the glass, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. She closed her eyes, breathing it in, not as a warning, but as a reminder. Storms come, storms pass, and some storms learn to stay. The city had changed again, and this time Evelyn wasn't sure she recognized it. It wasn't the skyline, that was eternal. The same glass and steel ribs cutting the sky, the same pulse of yellow cabs and sirens below. No, it was the rhythm. Everything felt faster, louder, greedier. Success had become its own language, spoken fluently by those who had never known failure. She stood on the balcony of her office, high above the restless grid of Manhattan, watching it move. The Homemaker Fund had exploded in scale, chapters in 20 states, international offices in London and Singapore. Her face, once splashed across finance pages, now appeared on magazine covers beside words like visionary icon and resilience. But with every headline, every award, Evelyn felt something tightening again around her throat. Fame, she thought, was just another kind of cage. She hadn't wanted it to grow this big. She'd built the foundation to stay personal, a network of real women helping each other rebuild. But success attracts gravity, and soon came investors, partners, endorsements. They said they could amplify the mission, but what they really wanted was to own the message. One of them, a tech magnate half her age named Vanessa Cole, had joined the board 6 months ago. Brilliant, ruthless, the kind of woman who smiled like a blade. She called Evelyn her mentor, though Evelyn could feel the hunger beneath the admiration. Vanessa was what she used to be, bold, impatient, unafraid to break what stood in her way. That morning, Vanessa was waiting in her office when Evelyn arrived. Legs crossed, tablet in hand, confidence like perfume in the air. "You're late," she said with a grin. "I wasn't aware I answered to anyone," Evelyn replied, setting her coat on the chair. Vanessa laughed. "Relax, I just meant we're losing daylight. I've got something big." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "That's what you said before we launched the global initiative." "This is bigger," Vanessa said, standing and pacing in front of the window. "I've been talking to some venture funds. They want to integrate the Homemaker Fund into a digital platform, something scalable. We could reach millions of women with one click. Evelyn's voice stayed calm, but her stomach sank. You mean turn it into an app? Not just an app, a full-scale ecosystem. Imagine virtual mentorships, AI-driven funding algorithms, sponsorships, brand partnerships. The future is digital, Evelyn. This is how we survive. Survive? Evelyn repeated quietly. We're not dying. Vanessa turned, her expression sharp. Not yet, but you know how this world works. Attention spans are shorter than breath. If we don't evolve, someone else will do it for us. We can't stay sentimental forever. Evelyn walked toward the window, her reflection layered against the skyline. Sentimental, she murmured. Is that what you think this is? Vanessa softened slightly. I think you care, maybe too much, but caring doesn't scale. Evelyn turned, eyes steady. Neither does integrity. The air between them tightened. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Vanessa smiled again, that diplomatic smile that always meant war dressed as civility. Think about it, she said, gathering her tablet. I'm presenting the proposal at next week's board meeting. I'd rather we stand on the same side. When she left, the room felt colder. Evelyn stood there for a long while, watching her own reflection fade into the glass as the sunlight shifted. She could feel the past repeating: ambition, control, the subtle seduction of power. She had built this place to be free of all that, and yet it was happening again, right under her hands. Later that night, she sat alone in her apartment, the city glowing beyond her windows. The same view she had once shared with Richard, though now the silence felt different, peaceful, not empty. She poured herself a glass of red wine and opened her laptop. The emails were endless. Event invitations, partnership pitches, press requests. She scrolled past them all until she found one that caught her breath. Subject: private invitation, Women in Power Conference, Rome. It was signed by Rosa, the painter she had met in Italy. The message was brief. I am curating an exhibition alongside a summit for women who have rebuilt themselves. Your story belongs here. Come, if not for them, then for yourself. Evelyn smiled. Rome, the city where she had first learned to breathe again. She typed her reply before she could overthink it. I'll come. The conference was held 2 weeks later in a restored monastery overlooking the Tiber. The air smelled of jasmine and rain. The walls were lined with paintings. Rosa's women again. Ordinary faces immortalized in soft light. The summit itself was small, intimate. No flashing cameras, no CEOs competing for attention. Just women, survivors, leaders, dreamers, sitting in a circle, telling the truth. When it was Evelyn's turn to speak, she hesitated. The moderator introduced her as the woman who turned survival into a movement. Applause echoed through the stone hall, but she barely heard it. She stood slowly, her voice low but clear. I used to think power was control, she began. That if I could master everything, people, money, fate, I could never be hurt. But control is just fear wearing a different dress. What I've learned is simpler. Power isn't about owning the story. It's about surviving it. She paused. The audience was silent, waiting. I lost everything once, she continued. Not just wealth or reputation, but the part of myself that believed I was worth more than what I could produce. The world told me I was finished. They called me a housewife, as if that were an insult, and maybe it was. But it was also a reminder that you can't destroy what knows how to rebuild. Her voice trembled then, just slightly, and the tremor made it more human. Everything I've done since then, this foundation, this movement, wasn't to prove anything. It was to leave a door open. For the next woman who thinks she's alone, for the next person who forgets they were built for more. When she finished, the room rose in a quiet standing ovation. Not loud, not showy, but full of reverence. Rosa was crying in the back. Afterward, as the evening light filled the courtyard, a young woman approached Evelyn. She couldn't have been older than 23, nervous, bright-eyed, holding a folder against her chest. "I wanted to thank you," she said shyly. "I used your scholarship to start my design studio. It's small, but I wouldn't be here without you." Evelyn smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't owe me thanks. Just promise me you'll help someone else when you can." The young woman nodded, tears glimmering in her eyes. "I will." Evelyn watched her walk away, and something stirred inside her. Pride, yes, but also something deeper, something almost aching, the kind of quiet fulfillment that doesn't need applause. That night, back in her hotel room, she stood on the balcony overlooking the city. The air was cool, the river below shimmering with reflections of gold. She thought of Vanessa, of the looming board meeting, of the slow shift she felt within her organization, away from compassion and toward commerce. She knew what she had to do. When she returned to New York, the boardroom was already full. Vanessa stood at the head of the table, her confidence razor sharp. Charts glowed on the screen, projected profits, partnerships, engagement metrics. "It's the future," Vanessa was saying as Evelyn entered. "Automation, expansion, monetization. We're building a global ecosystem that will redefine empowerment." Applause rippled through the room. Evelyn waited until it faded before speaking. "Impressive," she said. "But tell me, who profits from this?" Vanessa smiled thinly. "Everyone. Women, investors, the organization." "No," Evelyn interrupted. "Who owns it?" Vanessa's smile faltered. "We all do. Together." Evelyn looked at her, eyes calm but unyielding. "I built the Homemaker Fund so women could reclaim power, not sell it. You want to turn it into a brand. I won't allow that." A murmur spread through the room. Vanessa's expression hardened. "You can't stop evolution, Evelyn. You said it yourself once. Adapt or die." "I also said integrity doesn't scale," Evelyn replied. The silence that followed was electric. Vanessa straightened. "Then maybe it's time for new leadership." Evelyn studied her for a long moment. She could see it now. The same fire she once had, the same hunger to prove something. Maybe Vanessa wasn't wrong. Maybe the world did belong to people like her now. Fast, digital, relentless. She could fight, or she could let go. Evelyn exhaled, the decision crystallizing like ice in her chest. "You're right," she said softly. "It is time." Gasps around the table. Vanessa blinked, confused. "I resign," Evelyn said simply. "Effective immediately." Vanessa's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "I'll transfer my shares to the foundation," Evelyn continued. "Not to the board, to the women. Every beneficiary, every partner, every volunteer. Let them decide what comes next." She turned and walked out before anyone could stop her. In the hallway, her heels echoed against the marble. She didn't feel anger, or defeat, or loss. Only lightness. The kind that comes after years of carrying something too heavy to name. Outside, the air was cold and clean. She tilted her head back, breathing it in. The sky was grey with snow, soft flakes drifting down onto the city that had witnessed every version of her. As she walked away from the tower, her tower, she passed a newsstand. A magazine cover caught her eye, her own face, smiling, under the headline, "The Queen of Reinvention." Evelyn laughed quietly. Then she bought a copy, folded it, and tossed it into the nearest trash bin. That evening, she returned to the small studio she'd been renting near the river, a space with no luxury, just white walls, paint-stained floors, and a piano in the corner. She had started painting again in Italy, inspired by Rosa. Now it had become a habit. She stood before a blank canvas for a long time. Then, with slow certainty, She dipped the brush into deep crimson and began to move her hand. Steady, deliberate strokes. When she finished hours later, she stepped back and looked at what she'd made. A storm of color, violent and beautiful. The outline of a woman standing alone in the rain, head high, eyes closed, unbroken. It wasn't art for anyone else. It was a mirror. Her phone buzzed, a message from Daniel. "You really resigned? Are you sure?" She smiled faintly and typed back, "Completely." Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "Freedom doesn't need an audience." She set the phone down and returned to the window. Outside, snow had begun to fall harder, blanketing the city in white. She thought of the young women she had met, the ones who would carry the torch forward. She thought of Vanessa, fierce and ambitious, and hoped she would use her power wisely. Most of all, she thought of herself, not as a symbol, not as a survivor, but as a woman who had finally stepped out of every shadow, including her own. The storm outside grew heavier, but inside, everything felt still. And as Evelyn turned off the lights, the last glow of the city reflected in the wet glass, she whispered into the quiet, "Let them build their empire. I've already found my peace." The snow kept falling, soft and endless, wrapping the city and her story in silence. Tomorrow she would wake early, paint again, maybe take a train somewhere she'd never been. For once, there was no plan, no strategy, no battle to win. Only life, waiting patiently to be lived. And beyond that, unseen but inevitable, something new. Something calling her not to rebuild, but to begin. Winter lingered longer that year. The snow didn't fall so much as it drifted, softly, endlessly, blanketing the city in a silence that felt almost sacred. For the first time in decades, Manhattan seemed to slow, the noise muffled, the rush suspended. Evelyn walked through it every morning, bundled in her grey coat and wool scarf, her breath blooming in the cold like smoke. She had no office to hurry to now, no deadlines, no board meetings. Her days belonged to her, strange, unstructured, full of space. At first, the emptiness terrified her. She had built her life on momentum, on the sound of her own footsteps echoing against marble floors. But slowly, she began to understand that the quiet wasn't an absence. It was an invitation. She spent her mornings painting, her afternoons walking along the river, her evenings reading old books by the fire. The studio had become her home, small, imperfect, honest. Sometimes she'd forget to turn on the lights, working by the golden spill of sunset until the colors bled into shadow. Every now and then, she'd receive letters from women she'd helped, updates, thank yous, pictures of families, of shops, of lives rebuilt. She kept them all in a box by the piano, tied together with a red ribbon. When the city grew too loud, she'd untie the ribbon and read them one by one, tracing the words with her fingers like prayer beads. One letter came on her birthday. The handwriting was young and hurried. "Dear Mrs. Harrington, I just wanted to tell you that I got into college. I used your scholarship to study economics, like you did. My mom says you changed both our lives. I hope someday I can do the same for someone else. Thank you for believing in people you'll never meet." Evelyn folded the paper, her eyes blurring with tears she didn't try to hide. Believing in people she'd never meet. Maybe that was what she'd always been doing, even when she didn't believe in herself. That night, she opened a bottle of wine and played the piano for the first time in months. The melody was hesitant at first, broken by pauses and small mistakes. But as she played, her hands remembered. The old songs, the spaces between notes, the ache of memory. She closed her eyes and let herself drift. The snow fell heavier outside, brushing against the windows like fingertips. For a brief moment, it felt like the world was breathing with her. In, out, steady, alive. A week later, Daniel came to visit. He still worked at Older now, though his humor hadn't aged. He arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee and a grin. Still hiding from the world? He teased, stepping inside. Evelyn smiled. Not hiding, observing. He looked around the studio, the canvases, the scattered brushes, the piano by the window. You've changed, you know. So have you. Not like this. He set the coffee down. You seem lighter, like you stopped carrying something. Evelyn glanced toward the canvas on the easel, a half-finished painting of a woman walking into the ocean, her reflection rippling behind her. Maybe I finally realized I don't need to fix everything. Daniel nodded. That's new. They sat for a while, sipping coffee, the silence between them easy. Outside, children were throwing snowballs in the courtyard. One of them laughed so loudly it echoed up through the window, pure and unfiltered. Evelyn smiled at the sound. Daniel leaned forward. You know, I heard Vanessa's running the fund now. Big numbers, huge press. It's become an empire. I know, Evelyn said softly. I read about it. You don't sound impressed. I'm proud, she corrected. She's doing what she believes in. It's just not my way. Daniel studied her. You could have kept it. I could have, she agreed. But then I'd still be living for what I already proved. He nodded slowly, understanding. So what now? Evelyn smiled. Now? I live. When he left, she stood by the window, watching him disappear into the swirl of snow. His figure blurred, then vanished completely, swallowed by the city. And for some reason, it didn't make her sad. People come and go, she thought. The only constant is the self you choose to return to. Spring came late. The snow melted into grey puddles, the river thawed, and small green shoots began to push through the dirt in the park. Evelyn spent her afternoons there, sketching people on benches, strangers lost in thought, lovers holding hands, an old man feeding pigeons. One afternoon, she saw a familiar face. Rosa, the painter, was sitting on a bench near the fountain, wrapped in a red shawl. Her hair had gone whiter, her smile softer. Evelyn, she said as soon as she saw her. Ah, I wondered when you'd come back to life. I didn't know I was gone, Rosa chuckled. You were, but that's all right. We all disappear for a while. They walked together through the park, talking about art, time, forgiveness. Rosa told her she had finished a new collection, Women at Rest. They are not broken, Rosa said. Not triumphant either, just being. It's the hardest thing to capture. Peace without perfection. Evelyn smiled. I think I understand that. Rosa stopped walking. You should let me paint you. Evelyn laughed. I'm not exactly model material. Not a model, Rosa said. A witness. The face of a woman who has finally stopped running. Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. All right. The sessions began the next week in Rosa's small studio, a quiet room that smelled of oil and wood smoke. Evelyn sat by the window as Rosa painted, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about small things, the weather, the news, old books. At first, Evelyn felt exposed, but as the days passed, she began to feel something else, stillness, maybe even grace. She realized that for the first time in years, she was being seen not for what she'd done, but for who she was. When Rosa finished, she turned the canvas around. Evelyn gasped softly. The portrait wasn't glamorous. There were lines around her eyes, silver in her hair, but the expression, calm, steady, luminous, was unmistakably hers. It's beautiful, she whispered. It's true, Rosa corrected. That's rarer. Evelyn touched the edge of the canvas lightly. What will you do with it? Nothing, Rosa said. It belongs to you. That night, Evelyn carried the painting home. She hung it above the piano where the morning light would touch it first. Every dawn afterward, she'd sit with her coffee and watch it glow, as if reminding her that survival, too, could be a kind of art. Summer came, golden and full. The city was alive again, music spilling from cafes, markets blooming with color. The Homemaker Fund turned 5 that July, and though she wasn't part of it anymore, they invited her to the anniversary gala. She went, quietly, sitting in the back of the hall, while Vanessa stood on stage. The young woman spoke with fire, commanding the room the way Evelyn once had. "And none of this," Vanessa said, voice steady, "would exist without the woman who believed we could rebuild our lives and our worth. Evelyn Moore Harrington, this is your legacy." The crowd rose in applause. Evelyn stood only when she had to, bowing her head in gratitude. Their eyes on her didn't make her shrink this time. They didn't make her larger either. They simply were. Afterward, Vanessa found her near the exit. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. "I almost didn't," Evelyn replied. "You hate galas." "Always have." They both laughed softly. Then Vanessa grew serious. "I know we didn't see eye to eye, but I want you to know. I kept your words in mind. Integrity doesn't scale." Evelyn smiled. "And yet you scaled anyway." "I tried to do it right." "You did." Evelyn placed a hand on her shoulder. "Keep doing it that way." When she left the hall, the air was warm and sweet with summer rain. The sound of the city was softer somehow, more forgiving. The years that followed were quiet, and Evelyn liked them that way. She still painted, still read, still walked by the river every morning. Sometimes she'd see her reflection in the shop windows and almost not recognize herself. Older now, slower, but free in a way she had never been before. She didn't visit Richard. She didn't need to. But one day, a small article caught her eye in the paper. Richard Harrington, former CEO, dies at 62. The piece was brief, respectful, impersonal. She folded the paper neatly and set it aside. That night, she poured 2 glasses of wine, set one across from her at the table, and whispered into the stillness, "Rest now, Richard. We're finally even." The next morning, she donated half her savings to a women's shelter in his name, not out of guilt, out of closure. Time passed softly after that, like a song fading but never ending. Evelyn grew older, her hair silvering completely, her hands more fragile. But her eyes remained bright, steady, alive. One crisp autumn evening, she stood on her balcony watching the city lights flicker like a sea of candles. The wind carried the scent of rain, the same as that night years ago when she had stood in her husband's collapsing empire, holding the future in trembling hands. She thought about that woman, terrified, determined, alone. She thought about all the versions of herself she'd been since then, the savior, the symbol, the exile, the builder, the painter, the peacekeeper. And she smiled, because they were all her. In the end, there was no one she needed to forgive, no one she needed to prove anything to. The world could keep its titles, its applause, its endless need to measure worth. She had built something far rarer, a life that was hers alone. The sky opened then, rain falling softly, gently like a benediction. She closed her eyes and let it touch her face. When she went inside, she lit a single candle by the piano, sat down, and played. The melody was the same one she had begun that snowy night so long ago. Slow, quiet, imperfect, alive. Outside, the city pulsed. Inside, the light flickered against her portrait, the woman in the painting watching her with calm, knowing eyes. As the final note faded, Evelyn whispered into the dark, "I'm home." And in that simple truth, everything that had ever broken inside her found its way back to stillness. The storm was over. The story was done. and in the silence that followed, it was as if the whole city exhaled with her. A breath of peace, vast and endless, carrying her name into the quiet, where all beginnings and endings finally meet.